Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give it another minute or so and we'll be getting started shortly. Thanks for joining. Okay, it's 4:01. I think we'll get started. Thanks to all of you for joining us for the September 2022 edition of Green Infrastructure, Climate and Cities. This is a monthly seminar series focusing on the challenges of climate change in cities and what we can do about it. We've been doing it since 2014, and you're welcome to go to the CC Run website and download and view any of our previous presentations. My name is Franco Montalto. I'm a professor here at Drexel University in Philadelphia, one of the lead PIs on CC Run, and like to just welcome you all to the fall. If you're joining us for the first time, you can also get continuing education credits. If you have not already emailed us, you can, and we can give you continuing education credits. During the seminar, we ask that you use the Q&A box to submit questions and reserve the chat just for technical difficulties. The focus of today's seminar is summer urban heat projects, and we're going to be comparing findings of interesting projects going on both in Philadelphia and Charleston. And we have three presentations, which we'll go through in sequence. So we'll do a presentation, and then a few Q&A, and then we'll do another presentation, another little Q&A, and then we'll have the third presentation with some Q&A and then some general discussion. So we're going to start with a presentation by Ivana Gonzalez, Christina, Gareis, and Nikki from Philadelphia. And they'll be talking about some heat work in Hunting Park. Ivana Gonzalez is a lifelong North Philadelphia resident with a passion for social and environmental justice advocacy. As the community outreach coordinator at Nueva Esperanza, Inc., Ivana is the point person for youth internship programming, environmental and social justice initiatives, as well as community education initiatives. And Ivana is going to be joined by her colleague, Christina Gareis, who is dedicated to the advancement of individual and community health and well-being. She is the community public health coordinator, also at Esperanza, where she conducts community-based participatory research, outreach, and education, focusing on disparate health-related topics. And then the third in that first presentation is Nikki, the lab manager at the Sustainable Water Resource Engineering Lab here at Drexel. Nikki coordinates community-driven outreach initiatives to address climate resiliency and focuses on the equitable implementation of green infrastructure and other climate solutions. So that'll be our first presentation. I'll do all the introductions first, and then I'll hand it over to Nikki, Ivana, and Christina for their presentation. The second presentation will be given by Richard Johnson, who's the Director of Community Science at the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University, where he delivers projects that develop accessible, applicable, and community-centered solutions to environmental challenges. He spent his career working on environmental education and community development as a Peace Corps representative and also as the manager of the Climate and Urban Systems Partnership. And Richard will be talking to us about some heat monitoring effort NOAA funded that he was engaged in this past summer. And then finally, our third presentation, a return to the CC Run seminar series, is Dr. Janice Barnes, who is the founder of Climate Adaptation Partners. Dr. Barnes works with public and private clients to identify their risks and vulnerabilities and to meet their resilience goals. In partnership with NOAA, the South Carolina Sea Grant, the City of Charleston, the Citadel, University of South Carolina, and others, Dr. Barnes has been facilitating the Charleston Heat Health Research Program, which we'll hear about today. So we're looking forward to really interesting comparing of notes between efforts going on in these two different cities. So with that, I will stop sharing and hand it over to Nikki to bring up the first presentation.
Thanks, Franco. I think actually Ivana is going to share her screen for me.
Great, thanks.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Ivana. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our September seminar. It's great to be here. Like Franco mentioned, we're going to be talking about cooling solutions in Hunting Park. Ivana, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So just to give everyone some context, as I'm sure many of you know, the United Nations established 17 interlinked sustainable development goals as sort of a call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. Next slide, please. So these sustainable development goals are great, but we have to keep in mind that trade-offs can occur with and among these sustainable development goals when considering adaptation strategies. And it is possible that a strategy advancing one sustainable development goal might hinder another. Next slide. Thank you. So this could be observed when the former mayor of New York City provided tens of thousands of air conditioners to low-income families at the start of the first COVID summer. And while this action does advance Sustainable Development Goals 3 and 10, which focus on improving health and reducing inequality, it hinders Sustainable Development 7, which focuses on energy consumption, as an example. So then the question becomes, how do we effectively synchronize multiple sets of sustainability criteria as we adapt to a changing climate? And then, so we proposed a project that aimed to do this by focusing on heat mitigation amidst a global pandemic. So looking at Hunting Park, which is a heat vulnerable and historically redline neighborhood in North Philly, they faced several challenges during the summer of 2020. As you can see in the photo on the screen, there were projected above average summer temperatures on top of the pandemic and its consequences, which include closed cooling centers and pools and job losses. So considering all of this, we knew that Hunting Park was a perfect and deserving place to pilot this project. And so with that, I will hand things off to Ivana.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. Can we hear me? Thumbs up.
Yep.
Awesome. So I just want to tell you all a little bit about Hunting Park. So it is a neighborhood in North Philadelphia. Like Nikki said, that is a historically underserved neighborhood that has faced a lot of redlining and lack of resources for generations. This is a predominantly Hispanic and African American community. Because of that Hispanic population, there's a large Spanish speaking population. So as you can imagine, there are sometimes barriers between community members and their ability to access resources and information based on differences in languages. And then we also have a really large under 18 population. So that means that there's a lot of children and young people who are in the area. So although Hunting Park has an 87-acre green space called Hunting Park, there's actually really few trees in the surrounding residential blocks. And also we've known that Hunting Park itself has been losing trees every year. So this leads to very hot summers and very few options for heat relief and mitigation, especially considering all of the pool closures and cooling center closures that Nikki just mentioned previously during COVID. So what happened was a group of people from the Office of Sustainability, some point organizations in the neighborhood, including Esperanza and Drexel, came together and carried out the Beat the Heat research, which was start to find out why Hunting Park was so hot and what can be done about it. So they found that Hunting Park is among one of the 4 hottest and most heat vulnerable neighborhoods in the city, according to the Philadelphia's Heat Vulnerability Index. And what that means is that Hunting Park can see temperatures as much as 22 degrees hotter than other areas in the city on the same day. So that's a huge difference, double digits in differences in heat. And so this excessive heat leads to decreases in health outcomes. We have found that there's higher rates of asthma in our neighborhoods. We have found that there's higher risk of heat-related illnesses such as heat stroke and heat exhaustion. It also contributes negatively to mental wellness outcomes. So we know that trees offer us lower blood pressure and higher levels of those happy hormones, lower levels of those negative hormones. It offers decreased number of environmental resilience, right? So if we have an area that's already experiencing a lot of heat because of lack of trees, that also probably means that it's has a lack of, soil exposure, which could lead to things like flooding and things of that nature. So we also find that there's decreases in social cohesion in the community, because when it's too hot outside, people tend to stay indoors. And when they do that, they're not talking to their neighbors. They're not keeping their eyes on their neighborhood. And so these are some things that we found. Urban heat. And so I'm going to pass things off to Franco to give you all a little bit of background on what an urban heat island is.
So we know that urban landscapes, for a variety of reasons, tend to be hotter than surrounding rural landscapes. And one of the first things that we wanted to do in Hunting Park was we know Hunting Park is hot, but we wanted to see how hot. And so we put in on our initial pilot block, which you'll hear about in a moment, we put in a series of Lasker Easy-Log temperatures and humidity sensors. And then what we did was we picked 4 different rural reference locations located roughly to the north, to the west, to the south, and to the east of Philadelphia. And then over a 1-year period, we compared temperature and humidity. I'm only going to talk about temperature at simultaneous measurements in both locations. And we compared to get an idea of the difference. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see some of the results. And this is preliminary work. What you see here are each of these boxes: September 2020, December, March, and June. So these are, we just put together the data on these 4 different months. And then if you look on the horizontal axis, those are those reference locations. And then the delta temperature, this is air temperature. So it's the difference in simultaneous air temperature between Hunting Park and those other places. And the box represents sort of like the middle 50%. The line in the box is the median. And what you can see, the sort of take home message here, if you look on the left and on the right, September and June, is that the daily urban heat island during the summer months, during those 2 months, it's about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius hotter on average over the entire day and night during the summer. But if you go to the next slide, we also parsed out just the nighttime, because one of the, a lot of the health impacts of urban heat islands come at night, when ideally your body would cool down and allow you to refresh and rejuvenate. But if the cement and concrete and all of the other urban surfaces don't continue to release heat at night, your body can't cool down. And in fact, we found that the nighttime urban heat island in Hunting Park was 6 to 9 degrees, depending on which rural reference location you look at, 6 to 9 degrees Celsius on average, or a median. And it could be much more than that. You can see, like during September, there were some nights, where it was close to 30 degrees Celsius warmer in Hunting Park compared, if you look at those outlier dots. So fairly significant urban heat island, which we knew, but it was good to quantify this. You can go to the next slide. And I'll hand it back over.
Yeah, so let's talk about what this became. So finding out that information, they know that they wanted to create a project which intended to transition this data that they just gathered from the Beat the Heat research into actionable solutions that, number one, offered heat relief, fit the available space of the blocks, because we know that from history, these blocks were built in closer to factories, so they were a lot narrower than some of the larger blocks that we see in our city. It needed to be sturdy and long lasting. As you know, public structures have to have that wear and tear from weather, and also people from the public that have access to it as well. It needed to be cost effective. It had to include community engaged participatory design process. So that means that we engaged the people who the solutions were for, so that they could have a say and then buy in, and then we have a long lasting solution there, a more holistic approach. And then also that one that provided job opportunities to residents. So based on the community input that they gathered, they were settled on a 2-pronged cooling approach. So the first was sprinklers for a nice, fun, evaporative cooling option. So we know that as water evaporates, it brings a lot of temperature. It brings the temperature down of the object that it's evaporating from. And so if that's your body, then it's a great thing, right, for the summer. So we had the sprinkler option there, and it's really great for blocks that have a lot of children, which, if you can remember from earlier, we have a very large under 18 population in Hunting Park. So that was super great, and people were excited about it. And the second approach was a physical bench structure, which included an umbrella that offered shade/heat relief. And so what was really great about this structure, which you can see in this bottom picture here, really beautifully made, is that it's compact, it's sturdy, and the design is made from a strong cured wood, so it has like that long lasting effect. And it was also free for the residents. So this was something that brought people out of their homes to help keep relationships strong, to hit on that social cohesion that I spoke about a little bit earlier, because if they have somewhere to sit outside that's cool, they're more likely to keep their eyes on the block. They're more likely to talk to a neighbor who maybe they haven't been able to talk to during COVID or an especially hot summer, which we know we've been experiencing here. So we ended up installing about 35 bench planters on the 4400 block of Marshall Street, and this was wildly successful. And so because of that, we had people knocking on the doors of Esperanza, of the recipients of these bench planters, saying, "Oh my gosh, how did you get that? I want one for my block." And so the really great thing that this brought to us was it was a physical structure that gave us a foot in the door to then offer people the other services that we had at Esperanza. So it was really great for that. And, Drexel began collecting survey information, survey data, and investigating resident satisfaction with the cooling structures. And we found that they were, yes, in fact, very satisfied with these structures, and were asking for more. So talking about years 2 and 3, so we built and installed planters on 9 additional blocks. So the second year we did 100 planters, and the third year we did 72 planters. And so what we also did was make sure that we followed through with that 2-pronged approach. Blocks that received planters also got those sprinklers. So they had the evaporative cooling, and then also that shaded cooling option for them. And now I'm going to pass things off to Christina.
Hello, everyone. So Esperanza had a summer youth internship that consisted of approximately 20 students, and we worked with Drexel, and they participated in different environmental stewardship activities, such as data collection. So the students went out between July 2022 to August 2022, and they collected data 6 times throughout the internship. And it consisted of the students being divided into small groups, and they were walking around with the Kestrel 5400 and IR surface temperature gun, and they recorded the results along the specific walking route. And you can see here in the picture below that there are specific stops that the students went to and recorded the data at that specific stops. And the final bench planters were also installed this summer, and we also distributed sprinklers to different community residents. And more about data collection. So in addition to the cooling solutions, we also collected temperature data and qualitative survey data. Between years 2 and 3, we shifted our focus from air temperature and humidity to wet bulb globe temperature. And wet bulb globe temperature is different because it takes into account temperature and humidity, as well as wind speed and solar radiation. To collect wet bulb globe temperature data, we used fixed sensors that were installed outside of Esperanza, as Franco mentioned, and as well as mobile sensors that were used by the civic scientists at specific points throughout Hunting Park, which is what I just mentioned in my previous slide. For surface temperature, we used an IR thermometer, which is similar to the ones that you would see at a doctor's office. And lastly, we have been collecting qualitative data via surveys to characterize how the planter benches are impacting residents' lives.
So this is just some of the preliminary data that we collected this summer. The N values are quite small. We were learning how to do this. I would say from an educational perspective, the youth who were engaged in the Esperanza programs really had a lot of fun walking around using these sensors. And then we collected this data, which would have been very, very difficult to collect any other way. So we'll show you some of the data points, but I think we really need to continue collecting data in order to get our sample size up. But what you're seeing here are box plots showing from the FLIR surface temperature gun. And we've been to the measurements, although, you know, as Christina showed, they covered a lot of different points. We've been the measurements into non-shaded concrete, shaded grass in the hunting park, and shaded concrete. And, you know, the take-home message here, no surprise that the non-shaded concrete was the hottest on average and on median, and even with the extremes, and it was more than 20 degrees Celsius hotter than, if you look at the, it could have been up to 20 degrees Celsius hotter than the shaded grass. So big differences in surface temperature. And if you go to the next slide, we show the differences in wet bulb globe temperature. Here, you know, the same three categories. The results are a little bit, you know, we really need to get the N values up because, you know, there's some of these, you know, although the non-shaded concrete, the outliers show kind of what you'd expect. That's the 34 wet bulb globe temperature, the shaded concrete 32, looking at the outlier, and the shaded grass, something like 31. If you look at the boxes, the middle is sort of 50% of the data. It's a little, some of the results are a little surprising. And I think this is just because we're learning how to use the sensors and we need to get some N values. I'll just show, if you click one more time, you'll see the, you know, what we were interested in is comparing the wet bulb globe temperatures that we were measuring to these sort of precaution values that are published by the National Weather Service. And so if you focus on, if you click one more time, the 26.7 is sort of the range above which you begin to see, you know, some health precautions. And what you see is that throughout Hunting Park here, you know, no matter where you were, non-shaded concrete, shaded grass, or shaded concrete, there were an awful lot of measurements that were above that action level. So I think we're, you know, we got to do, the results are a little inconclusive in terms of the differences between the surfaces, but the work is ongoing. And we just wanted to show some preliminary data. Keep going.
Okay, so to wrap things up, I did just want to mention that, you know, we have been learning so many lessons throughout this journey, and we were fortunate enough to establish lasting relationships with the community members as well as Esperanza. And I'm sure I speak for the whole team when I say that I'm very grateful to have had a chance to work on this project. As far as next steps go, we're going to continue analyzing the data that we've collected so far. And then we'll also be spending the rest of the year searching for our next community partner and neighborhood to continue this project on. And then we'll take the first quarter of next year to spend doing community engagement, figuring out how many planter benches we'll need, hiring folks to help build them. And then finally, we hope to have our first round of planter benches ready for deployment for the next neighborhood by the end of May 2023. And that's it.
Thanks,
Thank
Nikki.
you.
So let's take some, any questions for the team on the Hunting Park work. We can do some quick back and forth if there's any. I don't see any in the Q&A.
It looks like, Rami, you raised your hand.
Rami, go ahead.
Folks, for this work, really interesting. So I come from El Puente, an organization in North Brooklyn in New York, and we also have similar issues. I was wondering, in terms of your use of sprinklers for evaporative cooling option, I know, Nikki, you mentioned in the beginning that, you know, when aiming for one SDG, you could, you know, hinder another. So what do you think, like, in terms of long-term water conservation with cooling efforts? Because you did mention, you know, how in New York City during the pandemic, they used the air conditioning units, which also, you know, hindered the use of, like, the lowering the use of energy. So yeah, just wondering if you are thinking of different ways of cooling options that don't involve, like, water consumption as well.
Yeah, I think we've been using a variety of cooling solutions, such as the planter benches with the umbrellas. So I think that kind of helps with the water consumption. Franco, Ivana, Christina, I don't know if you want to add anything. But I know that we do try to approach it with a diverse array of options for those cooling solutions, if that makes sense.
One of the interesting outcomes was that when we came to the community and talked about heat, the project sort of started with a large sort of review of best practices from around the world, actually, and that's where we came up with the shade structure, the pavement wetting, which has been done for hundreds of years in Japan and has been piloted in some other countries. And then the third option, which we didn't talk about today, was also tree planting. And one of the things, I don't want to speak for Esperanza, but what I was told was that although we started the project and most of the residents selected the shade structures and to a lesser extent the sprinklers, the demand for tree planting went up. So in other words, once we sort of started talking about ways of cooling, people's interest in other forms of cooling, including trees, increased in the community. And I believe there were more requests for street trees after year 2 than there had been previously. But I don't know, Ivana, Christina, if you want to add in anything there.
Yeah, I can jump in there, and that's more than true. And like I was saying in the presentation, Rami, you know, when people saw that physical structure, they were then interested in talking to us, and in just talking to us, we were then able to sort of sell the other solutions that we have available, including trees. So then as time goes on and there's more and more of these structures out there for people to see, and then for us to connect with that way, it sort of starts to even out the amount of water that we're using, because now people are relying on trees. Now people are relying on these bench structures. Now the cooling centers are open again. Now the pools have just opened for the first time this summer. So once things start to be where they're supposed to be, heat mitigation wise, and investment wise in the neighborhood, then we start to see that our consumption of a single solution goes down. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you very much. I honestly commend you on the work, because we have the same issue. We're dealing with the same issue exactly. And, you know, we're talking about green corridors as well here. And I mean, I'll just give you an example. One tree planting in Brooklyn costs $3,500. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
that's insane, but
Yes.
that's what we deal with here. And so our advocacy has to work on that. And I love the work. And I know you mentioned that, you were looking for more organizations. If you want to come over, and partner with us as well in Brooklyn, we'd be more than happy to move this conversation as well.
Thanks, Rami. I think we have a question from Judith.
Yes, good afternoon, all. We're Susquehanna Cleanup Pickup, and we're on the west side of Broad Street. And we would love to have this project in our area. But so trees would be very important too, but the right kind of shade trees on our sidewalks, on our fronts, that don't lift the sidewalks. Tree maintenance is important, but we do know that sitting under a nice shade tree, we want to take it back to basics. I was raised where we shaded our house by not letting the sun into our house by shading. So it seems to me that we need to go back to some of those basics that we used to just live by, watching the way the sun is moving, and then getting out of it. So, that's what I'm seeing, is that we kind of need to go back to the old way of living, sitting under a shade tree, shading your house, without letting the sun in. So all of those things are great, but I would really like to see if we could add more just natural things and bring it around the whole city. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. Ivana, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Judith, so much for your question and your comment. And so I just wanted to say that, you know, we are really, really all about the right tree in the right place. Back, you know, 40, 50 years ago, where they were planting those trees, where we see now causing the issues, raising the sidewalks, getting tangled in overhead wires, being found in pipes and basements. Those were not the right species. They were really large species, 175 feet plus tall, usually London plane trees. And so what they're doing now is they're assessing each location and saying which tree is the best shade tree for this specific site and location. If there's overhead wires, you're going to get a shorter tree. If you don't have them, then maybe you can get a larger one. So it's just things of that nature. And I'd also like to point out that the tree species that we've selected, or more, I should say, the Pennsylvania Horticulture Society and Tree Philly has selected, and their arborists are typically very hardy. They're very drought resistant. They're disease resistant. They're sun loving, and they only go about 2 feet deep, which the pipes in the street are typically 6 feet deep. So you got that 4-foot clearance, and they typically only spread about 2 feet across. And you can have trees as short as 12 feet. So it's really about pairing the right tree to the right location. And we're trying our very best to make sure that that happens. If you ever want to talk more about it, I'm sure that our contact information is somewhere to be found. But another thing I want to say just really quickly, I'm sorry, is that we also would really love for trees to be the #1 solution. However, site suitability is an issue that we're coming up across and again in our neighborhoods, because like I mentioned earlier, we have narrow blocks. So there's L&I precautions and safety precautions that we have to, and legal precautions that we have to be aware of. We need clearances. For example, someone in a wheelchair needs to be able to pass between the stairs and the tree pit that's cut into the ground. If they can't do that, they're not eligible for a tree. Even if the owner wants the tree, will take care of the tree, has taken care of previous trees, you know? So that is when we come and step in with those alternative shading and heat relief structures, such as you know, the bench planter project, and also the evaporative cooling options with the sprinklers. So it's all about just trying to have multiple solutions, but still really trying to make sure that trees are our first, you know, line of attack for heat issues in the city.
Thanks, Ivana. I guess we should probably keep moving, but this was great. Thanks to all of you for this presentation. So our next presentation is going to be Richard Johnson from the Academy of Natural Sciences, talking about his work in Philadelphia this past summer. So Richard, take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Franco. Thanks to everyone else on this panel and everybody participating tonight. This is really exciting. I get the opportunity to talk about something called the Philadelphia Urban Heat and Air Quality Mapping Campaign. It's something that we led out of the Academy of Natural Sciences this past summer, and I helped to lead in my role as the Director of Community Science. And what's really cool is that practically everyone, literally everyone on this panel helped in the campaign in some way. And so this was something that really supports the, you know, a lot of the efforts like what Esperanza and Drexel are doing in Hunting Park. And so I'm just gonna kind of break that down a little bit tonight. So just to kind of give you a broad overview of what I'll be speaking about. Unfortunately, I can only talk about the plans for the results. We ran a campaign to measure and map the heat and air quality in Philly, but we don't have the results. They'll be available next month. So we can talk about the plans. I can talk about how we designed the campaign. I'll hit a little bit on the community participation that we were able to generate, and then hopefully this will get the wheels turning for any potential collaborations with folks, maybe even on this call, helping to let us hit the ground running when we do have those results. So, so big picture, this is a initiative of NOAA. It's a federal initiative. Basically, they provide funding to a group called CAPA Strategies to provide technical assistance to cities to run these mapping campaigns. And so they give the cities, CAPA Strategies gives cities equipment and expertise on how to run the campaign. And so it was a wonderful partnership. We're very appreciative to all the funders and supporters. So this is just to give you a little bit sort of just high level what we actually went out and did. There's a this is a mobile campaign. So folks were going out with sensors that were mounted onto their cars, more specifically the windows of their cars. And this occurred on just one specific day this summer. And we did it for the entire city. And that's what happens with all of these campaigns. What you get is a snapshot of the heat and air quality on that day. And here is an example of one of the sort of maps that you get as a result. It's one of the products you get. I will let people guess and put in the chat if they'd like what metro area that is, because as I said, it's not Philly. And be curious to know if anybody can ID that on site. The locations for this has been going on since 2017. Each year there's a new cohort. This past summer, there were 16 cities in the US and actually 2 abroad who participated. You can see in this map just, how many cities have participated. The ones in black, those are past campaigns, and the ones in sort of the more purple color are the campaign cities from this summer, 2022. Philly was one of just 2 cities who also received air quality monitors as part of our mobile campaign. And it was actually we're actually the 3rd city ever that NOAA has given those mobile air quality sensors to run simultaneously. So in some ways we were sort of pioneering that work, and that was really exciting. Charleston, South Carolina was a campaign in 2021, and I know, and so Janice, when she talks, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that. So that's just to give you a kind of a sense of where these have taken place. Our campaign actually ran on July 30th, which is, we collected a lot of data and it's still being processed. So we're really anxious to get it back. I wanted to just give you a little bit of background on sort of the methodology. The sensors that we're using, again, since this is a mobile campaign, the sensors just kind of clipped onto people's windows. You get a picture of how they were mounted. That's the heat sensor in the front and the air quality sensor in the back. We had to deploy these on a clear, hot day. And what was also really an interesting aspect of our measurements was that not only were we getting the measurements for heat and air quality for the day, but we were also getting them for 3 times throughout the day. So cars would go out and drive for 1 hour all across the city at 6, 3, and 7. So we were able to see how heat and air quality actually changes over the course of a day in the city. A little more specifically about the heat sensors, these came from Kappa Strategies. Kappa Strategies is out in Portland and again, provided the sensors and the technical assistance for the campaign. And they have a proprietary sensor. We affectionately called it the snorkel because that's what we think it looks like. But again, just you can see in that picture how it just mounts over the car window, rolls up, secured in place. And then it will take measurements of air temperature, humidity, and location because it has GPS every second. So it's taking a measurement every second. And, the previous presenters kind of referenced this a little bit, but, with these sensors, we were getting the heat index. So when you have the air temperature and the humidity, that's the heat index. That's kind of commonly, referred to as real field temperature. So that's kind of a unique aspect of all these campaigns is that a lot of the measurements that cities rely on right now are surface temperature measurements taken from satellites, whereas these really capture that experienced heat that people, the air temperature, the humidity, the heat index that people feel when they walk out their front door. And you know, one of the only ways to really gather that data is mobilizing a lot of people like these campaigns do. So the air quality sensors, real quick, these are off the shelf. They're called Airbeam 3s. You could look them up. You could buy them if you'd like. They can measure particulate matter, this very small air pollutants called particulate matter. They can measure PM 1, 2.5, and 10. Our study's only looking at 2.5. And you can see in this picture one of our volunteers or participants, Faith, up in North Philly, putting on one of the air quality monitors, which we called the Pac-Man Ghost, which is what we thought those looked like. So what you get, a key product, is these modeled maps. So these show Kappa Strategy gets you these maps that model, show you a visual representation of how heat and air quality is distributed in a city. I picked this one. This is from a campaign in the Boston area called Wicked Hot Mystic. It was modeling the Mystic River watershed. So the purple map on the right is air quality distribution, and the red orange one is heat. And so you can see that I picked them because they're one of the only other cities who actually have a map that visualizes both air quality and heat. The other thing to remember is that this is a sampling study, so we weren't having volunteers go out and drive every single street in the city. Really, this is a sampling approach where we're getting representative samples of the heat and air quality, and then Kappa uses some machine learning to make predictions for the entire city. So when we were designing the campaign, we were really intentional about alignment. Philly is a little bit different than some cities who have gotten selected to run these campaigns. In that, some cities use these campaigns as a jumping off point for a sustainability plan or a heat vulnerability index. Philly had that. Philly has a heat vulnerability index. You just heard about all the wonderful work that Esperanza and Drexel are doing in Hunting Park. Philly, recently completed its first ever community heat relief plan. And so we were a little more sophisticated, that we didn't have to create some of these resources, but we definitely knew we wanted to support them. So, actually it's our next presenter, Janice, who was real generous and wonderful thought partner when we were sort of thinking about this campaign. And she suggested sort of looking at where there's planned investments. And Philadelphia, we're in the midst of the city's about to release what's called the Philly Tree Plan. And this is a 10-year strategic plan to equitably grow and maintain the urban forest. And so with that, we know that there's a planned investment to do that. And so we approached the two key organizations who are driving that work, Philadelphia Parks and Rec and PHS, Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, and got them as our core collaborators so that the data that we generated would support engagement around that plan. And then for air quality, we wanted to, again, support some existing efforts. And so there's a researcher at Temple University named Tina Roseanne, and that's Russ Serbo from the Clean Air Council. This is a feature that was run in a magazine about a project that they're doing, which is looking at doing more environmental justice centered network of air quality monitors. And Tina had an NSF planning grant and was sort of looking to kind of like get that work jump started. And so we got together and said that this could be an opportunity to support that work as well. Philadelphia only has 7 permanent air quality monitoring stations. And so we wanted to make sure that the data that we would collect could indicate a need for any additional monitoring, especially in communities where air quality issues might be being underreported. In terms of the actual study design, just want to kind of, give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain. The first thing that we had to do, NOAA actually gives support to map 100 square miles. And so that didn't quite give us the ability to map the entire city, but it gave us the ability to map most of it. And what we did was we really focused as much as we could. We did as much as we could, focusing on the most heat vulnerable areas of the city. And so you can see the grayed out portions are where we couldn't quite get, or where it was so industrial use and just wasn't accessible. So we worked with CAPA. We broke the city down into 10 square mile chunks. And so we have 10 of those 10. So that's 100, right? So you can see we had like South Philly, Southwest, Center City, University City, West, on and on and on. And then we needed to plot out our driving routes. So in order to do that, CAPA asks you to identify areas of interest. What you basically do is you drop a pin in the center of that area of interest, and that helps guide the route. Since we were partnering with Philly Tree Plan, they had an existing priority map for where there was need for additional tree canopy. And so it was already using all the metrics that we were interested in as well. You can see, poverty, health, heat, which drove the creation of this priority map. So we thought this was perfect. And since there's planned investments for, the highest, the higher priority areas, we basically just dropped a pin in what were the centers of the highest, very high, and moderate priority zones for additional tree canopy. And then on the air quality side, the primary source of data that we used was EPA's ECHO map, which is Enforcement and Compliance History Online ECHO. And this was, the Clean Air Council here in town sort of really suggested using this as sort of our data-driven approach. And you can look up facilities who have recent violations for different things, and we just narrowed it by the Clean Air Act. And so we were able to see which facilities around the city had recent violations of the Clean Air Act. And we dropped a pin in all of those areas as well. So that was sort of our more like data-driven approach. We also knew, working with our collaborators and partners, we wanted to make sure that the final driving routes went by any busy roads. And in Philly, that'd be like, our interstates or the Vine Street Expressway. And that we just sort of eyeballed based on, looking at a map. CAPA also needs for this study to have a diversity of land use. So the sources I talked about just now, they really indicated areas where there might be heat and air quality issues. So we needed to balance that with other land cover uses. So we made sure that the driving routes were going to go past green spaces and the rivers and stuff like that. And again, we just kind of eyeballed it. And since it was a sampling approach, that was fine. And then lastly, but definitely not least, we did community vetting of the areas of interest and the driving routes. And so that added some even more, community-driven areas of interest to the maps that we already had. And so the final routes looked like this. I know it's a lot, but just wanted to give you a big picture sense of sort of what we were doing. That's sort of the lower half of the city and the upper half, and those blue lines are the driving routes. And so each one of those blue lines needed to take an hour to drive. And so people were going out in their vehicles at the same time at 6, 3, and 7 for an hour. And that way we were able to map the entire city. And those pins, those different colored pins, are areas of interest. To give you a little bit of a better sense of what that looks like, this is North Philly. This is our sort of quote unquote North Philly section. And you can see that the driving route, we, aside from just the pinned points of interest, which the yellow represents the high priority areas from the Philly tree plan, the blue represents the echo air quality points of interest. We also wanted to make sure like we crossed Roosevelt Boulevard because we know that's a busy roadway. Esperanza, and talking to Ivana, you know, she said the 200 block of, I'm probably not going to get it right. Wingahawking is a community identified air quality issue, you know, hotspot. So let's drive down there. So we added that, and then the black thermometer sort of icons there are where, you know, Drexel and Esperanza were doing some of their measurements. And so we wanted to sort of co-locate on the day to make sure to kind of like compare data. And so all these driving routes are actually, you know, available. I'd be happy to share them if anybody wants to dig in a little more. And we could probably arrange that through Nikki, or you can contact me directly. So I wanted to talk a little bit about community participation. This is a key element, a key feature of all the campaigns across the country. And I just wanted to speak to its value for us locally and our experience with it. And as you can see here, there's Ivana and colleague Roberto, who's not on this call, but he went out and drove a route for us that day. And they're with a local meteorologist from Fox 29 in that picture. So it was really cool. So what was kind of unique about our campaign is how intentional we were about prioritizing the groups who are already working on these issues in the most heat vulnerable areas of the city. I think it kind of set our campaign apart and was something we're really proud of. So we worked through our collaborators and, you know, partners at the Academy and Drexel to identify potential community groups. For example, Philadelphia or Pennsylvania Horticultural Society has a large network over the city called the Philly Tree Tenders. These are groups that are going out and actually doing community tree plantings in their neighborhoods. And so we worked with them to identify existing tree tenders groups and partner organizations like that. And it was invaluable. I mean, these are the groups that helped us vet the areas of interest and actually drive on the day of the campaign. 7 out of the 10 areas were driven by community groups. We compensated the community groups who participated. So it was really wonderful. So we also saw this as an opportunity to engage the larger public. And so where we were able to sort of round this out, especially in areas that weren't quite as heat vulnerable, we're able to, you know, engage the larger public. These were museum members or Drexel students, or even just the general public who were able to sign up. All in all, we had 50 people participate on the day of the campaign, and it was a ton of work, but it was definitely worth it. And just to give you, just kind of, you know, what I say is that this campaign was not just about the data; it was about the data and the engagement, meaning that the engagement is equally as important as the data. And the data that we produced with residents is now we have a sense of shared ownership, which is sometimes rare when we generate these kind of studies. And because it was an event, you know, it was one day and everybody was going out and so many people were involved, it really generated a lot of attention, which was the opportunity to raise a lot of awareness about these issues. And I think we had 11 stories run in the media over 3 months, ranging from, Ivana there on our local news station in front of one of the bench planners, to a Philadelphia Inquirer article where one of the reporters actually did a ride along on the day of the campaign with one of the community members who was going out and mapping her community. And then, sometimes you just find yourself being interviewed live on the Weather Channel. So, it was a range of different media attention that we got. And what was great was, especially the day of, it really allowed people to see that they like what they were a part of and what they helped to make happen. And it's definitely, all of this stuff is things that we're hoping to build off of. Okay, so the results, which I know everyone really, including me, really interested in. I can only talk about what they're going to look like. I can't actually tell you what they are, but I will show you what they're going to look like. Again, I'm using Charleston as the example here. Every campaign city's results gets posted on the Open Science Framework website. So they're, open source. What you're gonna eventually see for Philly is where it says rasters. Those are the modeled maps of the heat index for the city at 3 times of the day. And then you also have the processed traverse points. And so Kappa takes out some outliers and anomalies, but it's pretty close to the raw data. So cities are able to play around with that, with those second by second measurements that are recorded through the campaign. And then you have a summary report. And these reports, they're like 20 pages long. And so they cover a bunch of stuff. They give summaries, they talk about the process, the methods, and then they give you the maps. And not only do they give you the modeled maps, but they also give you a visualization of the traverse point measurements. So that's the map on the far right, that's the lines. And so you can actually see a visualization of those second by second measurements as well. So there's a lot of things that, we could do with all of that data. What we definitely will do is disseminate the information once we have it. And this is going to be in partnership with our collaborators and community groups. We'll do this in part through the Academy's existing programming platforms, like our Academy Town Square speaker series. We'll just kind of capitalize on all the interest and attention that the campaign has already gotten. Advocate. So the goal has always been able for communities to be able to use this data to explore and advocate for different solutions to heat and air quality issues in their communities. And so, again, supporting the work, very closely with our collaborators. We want to make sure that this is an opportunity to really support engagement around that work. And so again, it's the data, but it's also using that data and that engagement that we've generated to sort of advance the priorities of those plans. And I would say that, I mentioned that Philly is only one of 2 cities that were able to get the air quality monitors. That's a huge opportunity because right now, a big conversation in Philadelphia, probably in other cities, is the conversation around cumulative impacts. So the fact that we're going to be able to look at air quality and heat and the cumulative impact that those might be having on communities is a really exciting opportunity as well. And then I would say collaborate. And I'm leaving this intentionally open because I really hope that just knowing the background and the design of the campaign, that people will come and want to, bring forward ideas about how we could use this data, and again, hit the ground running when we do get it. So I'd love to have that conversation. I'm sure, maybe some of that will bubble up in the Q&A, but if not, I'm putting my contact information here, and I would love to, have a conversation with anyone about how we can make sure we use this data and capitalize on this opportunity.
Thanks so much, Richard. That was great. Really exciting. I'm dying to find out what the data looks like. I'm sure you are.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea when that will be?
So we've been told October. So next
Okay.
month. Yeah.
Okay.
And at least for the heat data, then we'll see. Because the air quality is kind of novel. But October, generally speaking.
Okay. I invite folks to put questions in the chat. I believe there's a question, Judith. I'm not sure if you have your hand up from before, but I'm going to open it up for you to ask a question.
Yes. Yes, thank you. A new question. Richard Johnson, thank you so much. We're members of the CUS group. Richard expand a little bit on that. But I'm here today because of the support that we got from Richard Johnson and the Academy and wow. Look, everything that you've done with the CUS group is so powerful. And I want to talk about collaboration. I want to talk about additional information in this regard. We have a lot of construction where a lot of dirt is being left uncovered. So I don't know if when you went to the EPA that you got some of the violations that have been called in from North Philadelphia near Temple. So that's another collaboration that I'm thinking of where we can be supported in adding that air quality that's impacting our youth with asthma and respiratory issues from our seniors. So that's one thing I want to discuss. And again, I just want to talk about advocacy and trees, because as we use that as a solution, this tree planting, we want to make sure that we pull in the maintenance any way we can to make sure that arborists and others who understand trees and as they mature, that we have that input. But this is all great, you all. I just wonder how many people from who did the surveys, who are part of it, are on this call and continue to be involved, because it's so important that we stay at the table. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Judith.
Well, yeah, I mean, Judith, you're a rock star, and that's very nice of you to say. But I mean, you're really the rock star here, and I'm so glad that you're on the call. I think as I mentioned, some of the other dissemination ideas, programming ideas that we have might reach a different audience than tonight, and we just we're open to partnering with communities to get this information out so that the residents who are impacted by the issues are, part of the conversation for sure. So we'll be definitely doing that through a variety of programming, but we are welcome to tailor some programming as well. And I also would say I'm not, I can't. The Philly Tree Plan folks are, we're such great collaborators, and just I'm not driving that work, but I do know that there was a large emphasis on not just planting new trees, but maintaining the existing tree canopy. And that came out as a very strong message from their community engagement. So I do think that that is being addressed now more than ever. That's a great point.
Richard, there's a question in the Q&A about plantable lots and tree canopy, and I'm just curious if if in your campaign, in any if you went through neighborhoods that had a high level of vacant lots, and if you'll be able to tease out sort of any kind of heat issues associated or lack thereof, if some of these vacant lots have been or grown with vegetation, if you're able to look at any vacant land issues in the survey.
I think that there's going to be opportunity to tease that out, hopefully, but we weren't intentional about driving past vacant lots. Given that there's 40,000, I'm sure we hit a few, but it's not something that we could do, because even that was a little too fine scale in terms of where we we're identifying the driving routes, since it was a sampling study. I mean, we really played around with very specific, like points of interest, but some were just too specific. And I think vacant lots is a little too specific for this study. But again, this is a jumping off point. So we can kind of cross-reference and then use that as the basis to indicate where there might be additional study needed.
Great. Well, I think we should move on, but thanks so much, Richard. We'll have some additional conversation at the end. So thanks so much, Richard. That was great.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll move to our third presenter, Dr. Janice Barnes. Janice, you're up.
How does that look?
Looks great. We can see it.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much. And thanks to everybody who's already presented. I just feel really grateful to be so blurry. Let me just turn that background blur off. I feel really grateful to be part of this collaboration and really appreciate the invitation to come back a second year and share some of the work that's happening in Charleston, because ultimately we're all in this network that NOAA is kind of weaving together, whether through a RISA or through this Heat Watch program. And hashtag sharing is caring. So what we're hoping to do today is talk about where we are years later after doing the Heat Watch work. What we hope to do in this time is talk a little bit about what's happened since we saw you last year and give you some publications that might be of interest. Talk about recent work, data that were just collected last weekend, following on the Heat Watch from last year, and then talk about this role of community science and some additional comparators that might be helpful for us to look at when we start talking about where is money being spent. So I'll go through that quickly. We have time for a conversation at the end. Let me just make sure this is advancing. So we talked a little bit last year about this kind of four-prong approach that we're looking for in anything related to climate change adaptation and climate change in general. One is, are you aware of the risk you have at a family level, in your community, whatever? Do you have coping resources available? Do you have a mitigation plan, hazard mitigation plan, not so much the carbon, but the near-term hazard mitigation? And do you have plans for how to adapt? And we've just heard a bit about that from everyone. So the progress that we're tracking in Charleston is against those. So what you see here is a graphic that shows on the right the kind of work that Charleston has been doing historically on flooding. They have tidal flooding, they have cloudburst events, they have groundwater issues, you get all the waters. And what we've been doing, and when I say we, I just want to pause and acknowledge this is a huge network of collaborators who are putting an enormous amount of effort into this. And we have a slide at the end that acknowledges that group. But what we are doing is growing heat awareness. So what you see on the left side is a series of efforts that really started around 2020 and has amplified. And what we're trying to do is to say water and heat are important in a city like Philly, like Charleston. We have some additional research that has been teed up under the guidance of Dr. Jerry Reeves, the former dean of the medical school at MUSC. One is a retrospective study to try to get a better handle from statewide data on kind of temperature dose versus response. And the other is a prospective study comparing temperature and air quality, like Richard was just describing, on morbidity and mortality data in Charleston. So that is just beginning. That includes several different medical professionals, as well as the Medical University of South Carolina. We've also published these three articles recently. The DOI is there if you'd like to see them. The one on the left is the personal biometric monitoring that we shared with you last year, where we're using hydrocons to track outdoor workers over the course of 2 weeks during a standard work day to understand individually experienced heat index. The middle one is from a student who at the Citadel who actually was part of the Heat Watch program, and she describes what the impacts have been in terms of active learning on her education and the way that she can take that into work. And then the one on the right is one that Kirsten Dow and I wrote about hazard bias. And what do you have to do when you're walking through 3 feet of floodwater to get folks to talk about extreme heat as well? So those are available if you'd like to have a look. We'd appreciate any feedback on any of those. What we're trying to do is break through this issue, this inherent issue of hazard biases, and there's no malintent anywhere. We got problems in both cases, but we have to recognize that sometimes there are opportunities for multi-benefit solutions, just like Richard was describing when he was saying, let's see where the money is already being invested. The city also has made some great progress. They took the data from Heat Watch, put that out with an ArcGIS resource publicly available. They also put together a tree canopy tools app to help identify the tree canopy issues. You can see some of the layer information on the right. And then they have, secondly, a street tree canopy story map that just kind of helps anyone who's interested in this, not necessarily folks who are working in it technically, but folks who are saying, how is this working? To see what the situation is, just like Richard was describing, where is that canopy? The potential planting areas, the PPAs there, don't have a link to that, but the Green Infrastructure Center has actually worked with the city of Charleston to identify places where trees of certain sizes could be and what the kinds of appropriate tree plantings would be. So the PPA material is available. And again, as Richard said, this is on many of these are either on the city of Charleston or on the Open Science Framework. So a year later, what are we doing with those data that you're going to get for Philly pretty soon? One of the GIS experts at the city of Charleston took the heat data from the peninsula. This image on the left is one of those outputs from Kappa Strategies, and couple that with some new work that is being planned with the Charleston Housing Authority, where there's going to be refurbishment, redevelopment, improvements across the portfolio of housing properties. And as this is just teeing up, we thought that it would be important to say, well, what do we know about heat in addition to what we know about flooding, so that as you're thinking about renovations or new construction, you have an opportunity to get the most out of the investment that's being made to reduce heat impacts, reduce the energy burdens, reduce energy insecurity, while also dealing with flooding and the kinds of housing retrofits that are necessary. So Casey Conrad in the city's GIS department basically did this 9-step process, which is, for those of you who work in GIS, this is probably pretty straightforward language, and we just listed it out here so that you can understand the protocol. But basically, he's saying across the 80 housing authority properties that are in the Heat Watch area, how might we choose to focus further analysis on some in order to bring deeper understanding from the initial level of watch data to then inform that renovation, rehab, new construction process. So basically the net is that with the larger housing authority properties where you have more units, therefore more potential social benefit, with the least existing canopy and the greatest possible planting area, that kind of suss that out to be this property here on the left. This is just north of where we conducted that personal heat monitoring and the wet bulb globe temperature research that we shared with you last year. So zooming in, this is the Gadsden Green property. You can see the building set up here on the right is probably a little easier to see. There's this part of the development and this part. So the colorful ones is our second part. The architecture is a little bit different. You can see there's very little tree canopy, a lot of open spaces, and certainly a lot of impervious and pervious, but monoculture cover. So what I'm going to tell you about now is, since that work was done and since this opportunity with CSA came up, we have just set up through, again, support from NOAA with South Carolina Sea Grant, MUSC, the Citadel, the City of Charleston, of course, University of South Carolina. I know I'm going to forget somebody. I apologize when I do. we set up this additional deeper dive to try to understand what's really happening in terms of urban heat in this particular setting, so that when those new investments are made, they're made in order to reduce the impact of urban heat as the new investments actually go in. So in 2022, 2023, we're doing what's called CHIRP, the Charleston Heat Health Research Program. If you see something, say something, like little birdie in the coal mine. So what I'm showing you right now is the material that's actually on the Sea Grant website with video recordings from each of the collaborators kind of explaining their way through, because you've all been through this, through what we've talked about yet today. I'll go through this relatively quickly, but our point in showing this is to say, when we move from kind of the technical team of the Kappa and NOAA team to working with the community, and this is really a community science effort, much like Heat Watch was, but really digging in at a much more local level, we really need to back up. We need to back up and say, what is this thing? Why does it matter? How would you even be involved? And why would you want to be involved? And then how might that have an impact, positive impact in the future? So we describe what CHIRP is and the fact that we're trying to learn more about the community. We acknowledge the partners. I'm going to look at this quickly and realize, of course, that I left a few folks out. These are the folks who are a subset of the larger Charleston Heat Health Research Network that has been working since that 2019-2020 time period. These are the folks who really dug in on this particular effort. And the question would be, okay, it's hot, I'm Southern, why does that matter? We bring the Heat Watch data back in. This is actually a map that my partner pulled together, but it's showing the same sort of thing. We then bring in some ACS data, including life expectancy, to try to situate how important it is to correlate areas that have other determinants of social vulnerability. We bring in data that explains the changes in temperature. In Charleston, there's an expectation of a tripling of extreme heat days within the century, well within the life of the buildings that are going to be renovated, surface life. We then, in this case, in this part of the presentation, we have physicians stepping in to describe heat as a deadly risk. We draw on NOAA's work to talk about vulnerabilities. This is a slide that Jen Runkle shared, I believe, last year, talking about heat-related mortality. One of the nurses describes some quick things that you can do, and then we tee up the fact that there are resources available. So that first bit is about raising awareness, and then we get into coping. So in this set, it looks like a lot of text on here, but what's most important is to say, we've just told the community there's a problem. Here are some near-term coping strategies that help reduce the impact. And one of the things we're trying to do is to connect physicians and nurses who are willing to give some time to almost like a hotline that you could call and say, you know, I take this kind of medicine, or maybe pharmacists are involved in this. I take this kind of medicine. Do I need to be thinking about its efficacy changing when I'm exposed to extreme heat? We're certainly directing folks to the NOAA resources, including heat.gov, which was just released. So those are more about helping individuals understand their personal risk a little bit better. So given my preconditions, my pre-existing conditions, what might greater exposure to extreme heat in my home or in my work do to me? The coping resources as well include places where you can go to cool off. With COVID, obviously, cooling centers have been difficult. So we're also emphasizing ways to stay cooler at home. So things like the LIHEAP program in order to get energy support, but also programs like the one that we started with earlier when we're talking about New York giving away air conditioners. There are also programs like that for seniors in South Carolina. We also started talking about mitigation activities. So what can you do if you have control, if you're in a situation where you have control inside your home, or it is your home to own and you have control outside your home as well. So how can you begin to use shading like Ms. Judith was talking about? Or if you have control of the site, can you begin to do some depaving to cool an area? Charleston has also begun testing some of the surface painting, which I believe Philia has as well, to see whether or not they may be able to cool down some areas. And then both the state and Dominion Energy have some weatherization programs available in addition to energy assistance to help people retrofit in order to reduce the energy burden and be able to safely shelter at home. And why is this important? It's important that if we raise the problem, that we have some near-term solutions while these larger mitigation and adaptation programs for tree planting, trees growing in, or major changes with green infrastructure, they take more time, right? So in that pipeline of time, we have lots of heat seasons that need attention. We've also begun, many cities have this ready to go, but Charleston did not. So they've started to identify public places that have cooling available. So that's the kind of awareness, coping, mitigation, adaptation component. The next thing is to explain how this research actually works. So what are we trying to do? Going back again to that heat watch data, the first phase is to learn more about this microclimate around this particular development, including the hot temperatures, including wet bulb globe temperature, including the material, the surface material differences. If you remember last year, we talked about a 40-degree range in the same surfaces, in the same temperature, at the same place, in the same day. And then to raise more of the heat health awareness. And then in the second phase, it's more about acting. So identifying resources to help people cope in addition to the ones I just shared, as well as identifying ways to begin to cool that environment as those larger investments are made. So we started looking at things like the planted and paved surfaces and trying to work with the community to both tell us, where do you find it to be hotter? And then also, where are you picking up some cool breeze? Because the folks who live here are going to know more than anybody else about where those spots are. We also had community scientists working last weekend to capture data in targeted areas. The interest areas on the right are kind of like zooming in from what Richard just said, to say, we really want to understand this area by the playground. We want to understand this area just outside of a home that has a porch or a home that doesn't have a porch. So do you have any buffering on that heat exposure? Those sorts of things. And this little toolkit on the right was what was provided to the community science just to help frame up what to look for. We also then said, you know, the architecture here is really different. So if you have a home where the paint color is darker, or you have a home that has shading on an exposed side that gives you some support, or you have a home that doesn't have shading, what can we learn that's different? So we looked at building components, and then we also looked at site components, like what are we seeing as the difference between asphalt, concrete, grass, bare earth, or other kinds of plantings, knowing from our last year's research that there is quite a bit of difference in those surface. And I think Franco talked about that a little bit earlier as well. So how are we going to learn from that? We across this time period and this work with NOAA, this next iteration, we had this community outreach weekend before last, where Scott Curtis, who runs the James V. Neer Center for Climate Studies at the Citadel, and members of the Sea Grant team in the city met with community members to try to explain and get feedback about this program, and to also introduce the Kestrels, to introduce the FLIRs, to really talk about this kind of project and to learn more from the community. And then last weekend worked with the community, again, providing stipends or providing compensation, and also working across generations. So there were school children there were university students there were community members there, across generations, from all the way up to elderly residents who had seen quite a bit and were able to share quite a bit. So that data collection just completed. Those data are now in analysis, and in October, we will take those data, the analysis, back to the community to share what we've learned, kind of ground truth that and make sure we haven't missed something, and then hold a tabletop exercise with NOAA and the CHA team in the fall, and in the winter hold a workshop with CHA, which will hopefully help inform the investments they're getting ready to make. So these are the tools. We've talked about them a few times. They continue to provide great value for community science. I won't go through this because we've touched it a couple of times in the previous presentations, but go Kestrel, don't own stock, go Fleer, don't own stock. And the surface material, I just want to reinforce how important this is, particularly in places where big investments are about to be made. If you can intercept that and avoid a material that's going to retain or amplify heat even further, important to do so. And then to also acknowledge that it's super important that we do these on just normal days. So we're not looking for an extreme heat day to do this. We're looking for the typical lived experience and making sure that we're capturing what's happening on any given day so that these data can be fully contextualized. So we asked the community to participate with us. Like I said, they did do so. They'll be recognized in the results and be part of the process going forward. They've raised some great questions for us and certainly introduced us to issues in the community that we didn't know to ask about. And what we hope to do is to follow the work that the Clio Institute did in Miami when they ran the community workshop on heat, and certainly have opened it up so that not only the city, the Citadel, and South Carolina Sea Grant, but also others in the community can be more fully involved. So that's that project. And here's that list of collaborators. I know I was missing some folks, but everyone here has helped in some way over this 3-year journey. And I'm really glad that the font's getting smaller and the list is getting larger. So that's that project. And the last thing I want to share is last week, the Nature Conservancy released this report. You can see the link in the upper right. And this is about tracking statewide disaster funding. And as you know, at least when I checked last month, there was still no federally declared heat disaster across the country. Even though we've had state declarations, we haven't had federal declarations. So that goes to the way money moves. So one of the things that's really interesting is Nature Conservancy and Southern Environmental Law Center with the Donnelly Foundation put this effort together. And when we were doing the analysis, we were just trying to understand whether nature-based solutions were being included in any of the recovery projects. And what we learned was that they really aren't. But one of the other things was that none of those recovery projects were also addressing heat. So it's a real opportunity when you see numbers like this being put into a state over the course of what is really a 6-year period to say, wait a second, this place is going to have a tripling of the number of extreme heat days, but we don't have heat in any of those dollars. Well, that's an opportunity to intervene. So we just want to encourage that conversation, encourage more of the community science, because and the multi-generational participation, that's where sustaining capacity comes from, and just also encourage more sharing across the RESAs, because that's, I think, certainly good value for NOAA's dollar, but we are learning so much from Philadelphia, and we really appreciate the opportunity to share and continue to learn together. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Janice. That was great. And it's so inspirational to see how the work that you've done has inspired, city action, that they've sort of taken some of this mapping, some of this data and actually incorporated it in some of the housing maps that you were showing, which is really, really great. We have some time for questions. We've been perfect, 30 minutes each group, so we're right on time. There is a question in the chat about microclimates. And I wonder, I don't know if that's come up at all in Charleston, sort of like really, you looked at some of the sort of micro surface climates, but in terms of, this gets maybe into some of your wet bulb globe temperature data, have you been able to detect really significant wet bulb globe temperature differences in some little sort of corners of one development or another?
Yeah, we don't have the data from Gadsden Green analyzed yet. If Scott was here, he could probably tell you off the top of his head what the data were on the Kestrel readings. Those will be available next month. But what we learned last year when Chip was running the wet bulb globe temperature analysis at the Charleston Medical District was, yes, There were significant differences, and it had to do with some really funny wind behaviors with some new towers that have been put in at the medical district, where you kind of get this looping effect, and it's kind of holding hot air in a particular place. And then the amplifying conditions based on the materials that are exposed for those afternoon sun hours, where it really peaks up down there. So I think, Franco, in the work that Chip showed last year, which is on your recordings here, there's that slide that actually shows the range of differences. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it was somewhere between 80s on one end and 90s on the other end, which is a pretty significant set to begin with for web bulk load temperature, much less when you consider that the majority of the population there is patients.
Yep. That's great. Do you have any other questions? You know, it's interesting, this hazard bias, there's a term that was new to me that I know you mentioned it the last time you were here too, just sort of making sure that we're thinking really of all of the risks and not you know, sort of picking our favorite risk and assuming that those, I mean, that's so much of the climate crisis is about, and then, you know, the larger sustainability sort of context in which we're talking about these things. Not, I just find it, you know, and in the project that we talked about in Hunting Park, we were talking about creating jobs, we were talking about heat, we were talking about public health, we were talking about social cohesion, and it's, you know, such a temptation to just kind of like zero in on whatever it is. I mean, you know, whatever the risk is, or whatever the opportunity is. And it's so difficult to sort of come up with these multifunctional solutions, but really that's the only way to think about these problems in the world that we're in right now. It's just, you know, it's not just climate risks, it's all these other sort of compounded factors on top of it. So I appreciated that message.
Yeah, I want to give Charleston a big shout out, because they're dealing with some pretty significant flood issues. So to be able to step in and say, yes, we're going to work on heat too, that's great. Between the sea level rise, storm surge, tidal flooding, and rising groundwater and the extreme rain events, the city has a lot going on. So to be able to say, we're going to try to hold that work, move it forward, and figure out where we can couple up heat mitigation at the same time, it's a small city punching above its weight.
Miss Judith.
Oh, thank you all for the opportunity. I feel like I'm almost on here alone from the community participation standpoint. I don't want to overdo it, but Janice, thank you so much for adding the water and the heat. I know you all have heard about Jackson, Mississippi, and if I could be so bodacious, it seems like African Americans always catching hay when all these things go down. So I'm going to say we need to have more folks in the room who are most impacted, okay? We've been here long for many years catching hay, and I think we could add to the agenda all this science going on, you all. I'm about to step out the door, but I had to stay here to listen to every word, and I'm going to follow up with all of you all. This is great work. I want to make sure that the communities most impacted are at the table to hear all this beautiful research ongoing. This is not something, this is a marathon, you all. With that, I'm going to just say thank you to all of you all. Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this. Thank you so much, Richard, again, and all of you all new folks I'm meeting. Oh boy, I'm going to follow up. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Ms. Judith. But you know that there's an interesting question there in the chat about sort of combining water and heat and using harvested rainwater or reused storm water to help with cooling off urban heat islands. I know this question came up earlier in the Q&A, and I didn't know of any examples. You know, I think in part because of the sort of episodic availability of rainwater and the sort of continuous need in the warm season for heat risk reduction. But I'm just curious, Janice, if you'd heard of any sort of attempts to look at both flood and heat by sort of stormwater reuse, stormwater storage.
I don't have an example off the top of my head. The challenge for adding more water to a humid environment is it's not such a great situation for human health, right? We don't want to increase the humidity in a humid environment. Those kinds of cooling strategies may be more applicable in places where the humidity isn't at the high percentages that Charleston sees. We had the same conversation in Tel Aviv a couple of years ago, where the researchers at the university were very concerned about any type of additional water in the environment, given the humidity levels in Tel Aviv. But I think that the question is a great question. So where is that point where water as a cooling strategy works? And I'm sure there are folks maybe on this call who can answer that. I can't. And where is that point where you need to actually try to reduce the humidity levels, right? And yeah. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that there have been some really interesting joint efforts in Phoenix, and maybe that's a better situation for the kind of stormwater reuse. And maybe David Hondula could come and join this call and share some of the things they're doing there.
Thanks. So I guess I could invite any of our speakers who want to jump in and ask questions of each other. We could sort of do in the remaining moments just sort of a round robin. If there's any kind of we don't have any more questions in the chat, we've kind of addressed all of them.
I think there was one missed question in the chat. Let's see if I can find it. It was asking if rising sea levels considered in Charleston.
Yes, there's a massive perimeter protection project underway with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to deal with projected sea level rise. Also, the city of Charleston has a 2015 and 29 update on the sea level rise strategy. So those are some really big numbers. So it's even more impressive that the city's been willing to talk about heat on top of that. But those are all publicly available if you'd like to look up the Corps of Engineers perimeter protection for Charleston or the 2015 and 2019 sea level rise strategies.
Thanks, Nikki, for catching that. So any kind of general conversation?
Well, Franco, I think that one of the things that you're doing here to bring these kinds of groups together has certainly helped Charleston. And I know that Esperanza has been an incredible inspiration for the folks in Charleston. You were able to share a little bit of that work. Esperanza has also been a huge help in work with the Penn School of Public Health and the Weitzman School of Design as they've been trying to figure out how to merge up the kinds of interactions. So I want to thank all of you and thank Richard for all the work that he's done to advance this effort in Philly. If we don't, you just think about all the smaller towns that don't have the capacity that Philadelphia has or that Charleston has. If we don't kind of run that race first and establish some good practices that are easy to replicate, then we're making it harder for others. So I really want to commend you for creating the room for this collaboration and for all of the folks who are willing to share efforts so that we can learn faster together.
Thanks, Janice. Yeah, and thank you. I mean, because we need folks who are really going to come in and share these perspectives. But I see Ivana's got her hand up. Ivana, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. We feel inspired by all the work that's going on across the country, within our city, within our state, things like that. So, from Esperanza to everyone here, we really thank all of you as well. And Franco, thank you so much for having us on and, partnering on this project. I did see in the chat before I, raised my hand that someone said, how can you get involved? Well, if you're in Philadelphia, you can become a tree tender with PHS. They have classes twice or 3 times every year. It's 6 weeks, one day a week, I think a 2-hour online course. It's really great. You get some basic tree care. You get to learn how to operate and run your own tree planting. You only need 3 certified tree tenders to become a tree tenders group who can then carry out their own planting. So I think that's really cool. Besides that, you get access to all of their resources and events that they have across the city. You can also reach out to us at Esperanza directly to get involved. We always need help with tree plantings. We do, plantings in the fall and the spring. And so I think it's an incredibly blessed experience to plant a tree. And so for anyone who's interested in having that experience, definitely reach out to us at Esperanza. Franco, I don't know if you have our contact information on these, but I mean, we're more than happy to help people get involved however they can. If you want to canvas with us, if you just want to learn the science, we have an environmental steering committee meeting once a month where we talk about these issues. We bring on guest speakers, things of that nature. So, definitely just out and we'll try to connect you as best we can.
Thanks, Ivana. And the heat risk work, the planter construction and the sprinklers that we did in Hunting Park, we're now moving on this winter to several other communities in Philadelphia. And we will be hiring folks. That's one dimension of this project that we didn't talk about that much, was that the folks who built the planters were largely local residents, and they were given jobs and they were paid for their work. So it wasn't volunteer work, and we will be hiring more people to do more of that. So if you are interested in being considered for one of those jobs, you can just reach out to me. I guess, oops, I saw a hand up from Lisa, but that hand went down. So I guess I just want to thank everyone for this amazing combination of presentations. I think heat is something we're going to unfortunately have to continue talking about. And I think, sharing best practices in terms of, mitigation strategies, but also engagement and data collection and what works and what doesn't work and how to do all these various forms of collaboration is just really what we need to be covering. I have one last comment from Christopher Barber. Christopher, you're up. Christopher, if you're talking, you're muted.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just had one question going back, I guess, when they were talking about the evaporative cooling method earlier. How do you how do you balance the, I guess, the obvious benefits of that method versus the issue, concerns regarding, water conservation and efficiency concerns? Because it would seem to me that wouldn't be the most, conservation minded method as far as for water use.
Yeah, I mean, it's a consideration, right? When we started the project, we weren't in a drought. We're now in more or less in a drought. So you do want to balance these various considerations. You don't necessarily need a lot of water. The idea is just that if the solar energy goes into evaporating the water, which is a temperature neutral process, then the surface is not heating up. So it's not like you have to inundate the street with water. And in fact, in some of these examples that we found in other countries, it was just a sprinkling of water at specific times, or a ponding of water on the surface of the street, very shallow ponding of water on the surface of the street. So there are ways of doing it that are not wasteful, but of course it depends on local availability of water, and we don't want to waste resources. So happy to talk more offline about that.
Yeah.
Thank you, though. And thanks again to all of our speakers. I guess we're going to call it a day, and please join us again next month. First Wednesday of every month are these series. So please join us, and we'll see you then. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you.